Thank you for everyone that's joined us here this evening to discuss self-reporting. So as Pat mentioned, I'm the managing partner of our firm's Buffalo office. I'm a attorney and Army veteran as well, 28 years in the Army and Army Reserve, and I've held the clearance for nearly all of that time. And I've been cleared through many different agencies in my capacity as a security clearance attorney here at the firm. So we're going to talk today just briefly about self-reports. Probably won't take the whole half hour, but just something that's an important topic that we wanted to get a webinar out there and talk through. So here's some of the main talking points that we're going to discuss. We'll talk about whether an individual might be required to self-report something, some type of information or occurrence. We'll talk about who that individual might self-report to. We'll talk about why a self-report should always be in writing. And then finally, we'll talk just briefly about some consequences of failing to self-report. Pat, if you'd like to jump to the next slide, please. All right, so the easiest answer to the question whether an individual has to self-report something is to look at C3, or Security Executive Agent Directive 3. This is pretty easy to find. You can find it on the internet. C3 has multiple different portions dealing with reporting. So one of those portions is the information that must be reported, the types of things that should be self-reported. So these are the 4 categories that are touched on in C3, and there's a lot more information, so I urge you to take a look at C3 if you want to learn more about this. But these are the 4 main categories of information that is expected to be self-reported. So the first one, foreign travel, if you take a look at C3, you'll see that there are certain types of travel that should be reported to your security office. Some of them will depend on the policy at the agency where the individual works. Some of them will depend on the policy through where the clearance is granted. So not everybody knows this, but security clearances aren't all granted by the same agency. So some agencies do their own security clearance. Some agencies follow the typical approach like a DoD security clearance, but other agencies like FBI, DIA, even the Coast Guard, they'll do their own adjudications. So it's not always the same person that is adjudicating the security clearance or the same agency that's adjudicating the security clearance. Some agencies have different reporting requirements. So you'll want to familiarize yourself with the reporting requirements for the agencies that you're dealing with. But there are certain things like foreign travel with almost anybody that holds a security clearance. Certain foreign travel will require an authorization or approval to travel beforehand. Some, like an unplanned day trip to Canada, usually doesn't require any type of approval, but you're supposed to report it within 5 days of return. So there are certain types of travel that you're going to want to report. The agencies usually aren't too concerned with most travel, especially if it's just something like family vacation, something like that. But if you're traveling to a foreign country to meet with a government official, or you're traveling to a foreign country to meet with foreign contacts, then there might be a little more scrutiny, heightened scrutiny into that travel. So you'll want to make sure that you self-report that and you don't have to worry about it coming back to haunt you later. Similarly, you've got foreign contacts. So is that contact a government official in another country, and what country? So there are certain things that you'll have to be aware of, certain policies that you'll have to follow. One of them being, there's a certain intelligence agency out there that wants you to report all foreign contacts. So even if it's for example, a Facebook or LinkedIn or any type of social media platform, you're just a connection with somebody or a friend with somebody on a social media platform, even if you don't have that close and continuing contact with that individual or that bond. So if you recall, when you filled out the SF-86, for those of you that have a security clearance, it's a 2-part question. Do you have close or continuing contact with someone with whom you're bound in some way? Could be affection, could be money, could be business interests, things of that nature. So some agencies don't really care about either of those 2 prongs, and they just want to know if you have some type of contact with a foreign individual who's not a citizen of the United States. So you have to familiarize yourself with the agency that you're working for or through, and make sure that you're complying with their policy. But typically for reporting a foreign contact, they want to know if it's close or continuing contact and there's some type of bond. Something that we see come up a lot is a cleared individual begins a relationship with a foreign national or maybe somebody who's here illegally. When that happens, you're jeopardizing your security clearance. You're putting yourself in a difficult situation. You're going to have to report that relationship, especially when you look at moving in together, cohabitating, getting married, things of that nature. You've got to report that information, and it's probably going to cost you your security clearance. So you also don't want to put yourself in a position where you could potentially be getting your future spouse in trouble with the government if they are here illegally, or someone that you start a relationship with is here illegally. So just keep that in mind. But if you hold a security clearance, you are required to report that type of information. The next category that is discussed in C3 is reportable actions by others. So this is you as a cleared individual, you know another individual who holds a security clearance, and these are some of the triggers or issues that you have witnessed. Believe it or not, you're supposed to report this information. So you know that someone is displaying an unwillingness to follow the rules. You see a potential pattern of alcohol abuse. You see illegal drug use or misuse of drugs. This could be legal drugs or illegal drugs. It could be misuse of prescription medication, or it could be using marijuana or cocaine or some other illegal drug. And for the purposes of security clearances, marijuana is still illegal. It's still a drug that the federal government considers to be illegal, so you can't be a marijuana user and hold a security clearance. Not yet. Probably going to change in the near future, but it hasn't yet. They want to know certain mental health conditions. This is guideline I. They want to know if an individual has certain types of mental health concerns or diagnoses. Does that diagnosis make the individual less reliable or less trustworthy? So the government is going to want you to report if you think that somebody could potentially be triggering guideline I, which is the psychological conditions guideline. They'll want to know if an individual's behavior causes some type of doubt as to whether it's clearly consistent with national interest to continue that individual's clearance. Excuse me. And that's just kind of a catch-all. They always want to know if it's clearly consistent with national interest to continue an individual's security clearance. That's what they're looking at when they do periodic reinvestigations. That's what we're arguing in an appeal or a hearing. We want the judge to render a determination that it's clearly consistent with national interest to grant the clearance. And then finally, they want to know about misuse of government property or information technology systems. That could be someone on a job site is using a database for nefarious purposes, or is using their computer to look at pornography, things like that. Those all would fall under misuse of government property or IT systems. And then finally, certain financial reasons. So there are, it's not as clearly outlined in C3, but there are certain triggering events that are reportable, like, for example, spending a large quantity of money at a casino, gambling away $10,000, or coming into $10,000. They're going to want to know where the money came from, or why you spent so much money. Do you have a gambling problem? Is there something else that makes you a risk, makes you less reliable, less trustworthy? So there's a whole bunch of different potential issues when you're looking at financial considerations. Are you falling behind on paying your bills? Are you 3 months behind on paying revolving credit accounts, things of that nature? So there's a number of different financial concerns that could fall under category 4, and I just talked through just a few of them. So Pat, if you could jump to the next slide. All right, so who do you report to? So in every instance, it's really just whoever you consider your security officer to be. There's a different label. Could be your FSO, could be another abbreviation depending on where you are. If you're in the military, it's different. Your SMO, wherever you are, it's the security officer. It's the person you dealt with to get your security clearance. They're the ones that you should have process your SF-86 through. They send you the equip link to go in and do the electronic questionnaire. So that's the office that you're going to be self-reporting to, and you should know who your security office is. It's not always somebody that works right in the same space as you, especially in the military. You might be at company level, and this is usually someone at battalion level. It might be somebody in an S2 shop, depending on how your unit is structured. If you're a contractor, that's going to be whoever is sponsoring you. They should have a security, whoever your sponsor is, they should have a security officer that you're going to work through. And then your agency, they'll have security officers. It should be pretty obvious who you're speaking with then. But these are the individuals that you would do a self-report to. If you self-report, if you don't know who any of these individuals are, or you can't find these individuals, you'll want to self-report at least to a supervisor or somebody that you can self-report to that might have some type of position where they would forward the information to your security officer. You want to be careful. Obviously, you don't want to report a bunch of negative information to your supervisor if you can avoid it. You want it to get to the security officer. But if you don't have any other option, you would want to report this individual to a supervisor and create a record of doing it, which brings us to our next slide. Pat, if you could jump ahead one. How do I report? So the easy answer is in writing, always in writing. You always report in writing. And there are a couple of different reasons for this. The first one is to control the narrative. So let's say we'll just use marijuana because we just talked about it a second ago, and it's kind of a hot topic in the security clearance world right now. Let's say you use marijuana intentionally or unintentionally, but for whatever reason you illegally use marijuana and you want to report that. Now, if you're going to report using marijuana, you want to have a very well-written self-report, like a legal brief. You want to explain what happened, whether it was intentional or unintentional. You want to explain the mitigation. What have you done to correct the action? You want to talk about evidence that's going to prove that you don't have a drug problem or a drug habit. There's a lot of different types of mitigation that's going to be built into that legal brief or that written self-report. The reason it's so important to do this is because that report then gets forwarded on, and instead of getting someone else's spin on your self-report, you're actually controlling the narrative and you're sending forward the exact information that you want to provide, along with the mitigation to mitigate any concerns and try to avoid getting that statement of reasons or losing your security clearance. So let's say you don't do a written self-report and you call Mr. Security Officer and you say, hey, I ate some gummies this weekend, or I tried a vape this weekend. I was told there was no THC in it. I got really high. They laughed at me. They told me that the gummies or the vape had THC in it. I really messed up. I illegally used a drug this weekend. They're going, that individual that you're talking with, maybe they've used the vape before. Maybe they've used gummies before. Maybe they've smoked marijuana before they got a security clearance and they don't think it's a big deal. So they might pass along a different story, try to watch out for you. They might, minimize your use or do something that's going to create a record that's not necessarily accurate and could cause a problem for you down the line. But even worse than that, they might really hate people who use marijuana. They might think that marijuana is, the devil's drug and it's the gateway drug to everything else. And, they might have a really negative outlook on marijuana or people who use marijuana, and they might report it that way. They might report you as a habitual drug user and you were using marijuana at a party this weekend, even though you told them over the phone that it was unintentional and somebody's laughing at you and they made a joke out of it. They might forward that you lied about how you used the marijuana and why you used the marijuana, and they think you have a drug problem. This is your security officer reporting this, so they're going to treat it like a fact, and you're going to have a very hard time mitigating the damage that you caused by reporting it over the phone. So you should always avoid that. You should always have a very well-written self-report, like a legal brief, building in your mitigation and explaining the circumstances so that there's no one else that's kind of putting their spin on your narrative. So that's number one. Number two, speaks for itself here. You want to create a record of the report. So you may get a self-report in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Something might happen where you trigger a continuous evaluation. Something's going to happen at some point, and this might come up down the road, and they're going to say, you used marijuana while you held a security clearance and you didn't tell anyone? And you're going to say, well, I talked to Mr. Security Officer guy on the phone. And they're going to say, oh, okay, prove it. And you can't, because you didn't do the self-report the way you should have done the self-report. So you always do your self-report in writing and you save a copy of it. Save it to your laptop, save it somewhere else, but you always want to save a copy of it, create a record of it. If you draft your written self-report, normally we will draft them and we'll send them on to our clients who find themselves in a position to need to submit a self-report, and we'll tell them, submit by email, and then just save the email. If you submit by email, you save the email, it's there for as long as you have that email address and access to that inbox or your sent folders. So you're going to have a record. So when you come up at that next periodic reinvestigation and they say, why didn't you report this? And you say, I did. And they say, no, you didn't. If you reported it, they would have created a record of it. Security officers are perfect. And you can say, well, not mine, because here's proof that I submitted it. Here's the date I submitted it. Here's the email. Here's the document that was attached to the email. Same thing I said earlier, if you have to report to a supervisor instead of a security officer, you can show that you self-reported, because there's a really good chance that supervisor is not going to get your self-report into a record anywhere. But down the road, you'll be able to show that you created a record, that you self-reported that information. It's not up to you what they do with it after you self-report it. It's just your responsibility to report the information. All right, Pat, next slide. All right, so finally we get to the consequences of not reporting. So there's a couple of different things that you all have heard talked about, or maybe you read about them online. The old school way of doing things is periodic reinvestigations. It is 5 years for a top secret, 10 years for a secret, 15 years for confidential. There are different increments for each type of clearance. And on these 5, 10, 15-year anniversaries, anybody who holds a security clearance should be completing a new SF-86 and potentially meeting with an investigator and talking through everything to continue their security clearance. If there's anything that pops up on the SF-86 that's a problem, like drug use, while holding a security clearance especially, is very difficult to overcome. We have, but it's difficult to overcome. They'll want to know, all the details about this. So if you didn't do a self-report, but you went 5 years, 10 years down the road, and maybe your house got foreclosed on in between periodic reinvestigations. Back in the day, you would have got away with that. If you fell behind on credit cards, if your house got foreclosed on, if you got arrested, there's a whole number of things that you could have gotten away with not self-reporting, and you would have held your security clearance in most cases up until the periodic reinvestigation, when that information then turns up and could cause you to lose your security clearance at that time and your job at that time. Well, continuous evaluation is something that's been in the works now for a while. They're trying to get away from periodic reinvestigations and change over to continuous evaluation. In a perfect world, they would stop doing these periodic reinvestigations. That was the goal. But right now, they haven't achieved their goal. So they're continuously doing periodic reinvestigations, but at the same time, they're doing continuous evaluation, or CE. So under CE, everybody who holds a clearance is being tracked financially. There's questions about how much they track on internet and social media. I don't have any questions about it. I'm very confident that they are tracking that, but there's at least they say that they're not tracking too much. But I've seen cases where there were emails that were referenced in continuous evaluation cases. So I know they're monitoring online traffic and things of that nature. If you fall behind on your finances, if your house goes into foreclosure, if there's a tax issue, if you get arrested, all of these things they're able to continuously monitor or evaluate clearance holders for. And what happens is you violate an adjudicative guideline, or you have something that should have been reported under C3 and you fail to report it. Well, it triggers continuous evaluation when they catch it in their system at some point. And they'll usually send you an email or some type of notice of interrogatories. It's questions about, hey, we have information that you were arrested 3 weeks ago for drinking and driving. And then you have to respond to that. It's not a full-on statement of reasons. You just have to provide essentially the self-report after the fact, which is a problem because you haven't volunteered that information before being asked about it. So guideline E is the personal conduct guideline. You can have your security clearance revoked or denied for failing to report information or intentionally omitting information. And in failing to self-report, you have intentionally omitted that information. One of the strongest forms of mitigation to mitigate guideline E and try to overcome that guideline and keep your security clearance is that you made a good faith effort to provide that information before being confronted with it. You no longer have that mitigation because you didn't do your self-report, you waited until it was too late, you got asked about it. So now there's a potential that you're gonna have a hard time overcoming guideline E. And let's say the criminal behavior is one guideline. So you got the DWI or DUI. Let's say alcohol abuse is another guideline. They're concerned about how much you drink because you got a DWI and maybe you have a drinking problem. You have all of these other guidelines that you triggered. You might be able to clear all of these guidelines and you might lose your security clearance only because you didn't self-report the information. That's that guideline E violation. So you want to make sure that you self-report. Again, in writing, do a really good, thorough self-report. Talk about the situation, mitigate any of the concerns before they have an opportunity to issue a statement of reasons. Because if you get the interrogatories and you don't provide a good enough response to the interrogatories, then you may get a statement of reasons, and then you get that statement of reasons, you got 20 or 30 days to do a written response, and then if you're in the military, that's your last bite at the apple. You can appeal it through a hearing. If you work for most of the agencies, you can do the written response and then a hearing, with the exception of Department of Energy, who also does their own adjudications. Department of Energy, you only get one option, either a written response or a hearing. So each of the agencies, the process is similar, but you want to try to mitigate the concerns as early as possible, regardless of the agency, and that is with a self-report, a good written self-report. And then if you fail to do so, you trigger continuous evaluation. Then you want a really good written response to those interrogatories when they reach out and ask you about whatever happened that triggered CE. And then your next bite at the apple potentially is responding to the statement of reasons. All right, Pat. I think that's it for the slides. We will jump ahead to some of the questions that we received. There's only a handful, so I'll talk through those. Should be a slide here, the next slide, if anybody wants to see the questions. If you could jump to the next slide, Pat. There you go. So here are some of the questions here are all of the questions that came through. So the typical process, the timeline for what happens after self-reporting, I just talked through that in the last slide. The easy answer for timeline is it depends. So if you are able to mitigate the concerns with your self-report, there's nothing after. It's a very short process and your security clearance goes uninterrupted. If you are unable, let's say you don't submit a self-report, or your self-report was over the phone and it caused all kinds of problems because you didn't do a good, well-written self-report, then you get those interrogatories. You got to respond to those interrogatories. If you do a good job with that, then it's a shorter process. If you don't, you're going to go on to the statement of reasons. The statement of reasons is where things really start to slow down. You'll have to do a written response or a hearing, which could take a year or two by the time start to finish. If you're military, you could lose your clearance after that response to the statement of reasons, and then you might wait a year for an appeal because you have to do a hearing. So it could take anywhere from no time at all if you submit a good self-report and you're able to mitigate the concerns. You don't lose your security clearance. There's no gap in anything, or it could take up to maybe a year or two to fully adjudicate. So it just depends on the process and where you're able to get relief. So hope that answers the question. Jumping to the next question. What if an employee behaved inappropriately and got reprimanded by HR? Should that employee self-report? So it depends. If the behavior is any of the things that we talked about in C3, then definitely. All those things we talked about, misuse of information technology systems, if it was an alcohol-related problem, a drug-related problem, certain types of problems that are very clearly defined in C3, then you would have to either self-report or really someone else is on the hook to report you as well. So it's probably better that you self-report before someone else does it first. If it's any of those things, then definitely. Other than that, I really don't know. If it's a performance issue or something that doesn't necessarily have any bearing on your reliability or trustworthiness, then that's not really reportable. So you probably want to speak with an attorney. If it's something questionable, speak with the security clearance attorney. We'd be happy to answer your questions and discuss whether that's something that should be self-reported or not. All right, down to number 3. How long after leaving the military or contractor job where clearance was required is it necessary to report going to embassies to visit social purposes? So it depends. Remember I said earlier, you're going to want to look at the policy for the organization, look at each agency's policy, but the reality is you might not be on the hook to report at all after you get out, because if you're not continuing with that security clearance, if you no longer have a security officer because you no longer have a sponsor, then it might be tough to report to somebody anyway because you don't really have anybody to report to. But if you are jumping from one position to another, you're planning on maintaining your security clearance, you think that when you go maybe back to work, or you're going somewhere where you think you'll use your security clearance and you're just between positions, you'll want to reach back out maybe to the security officer that you had at your last sponsor, provide the information, do it in writing so that you have a record of it, so that if anyone comes to you later and says, well, you did all this foreign travel in between leaving your last position and starting a new one, and you didn't report it. You can say, well, I didn't have a sponsor, I didn't have a security officer, but I did take the extraordinary measure of self-reporting to my previous security officer. I don't know what they did with the information, but here's proof that I self-reported it. All right, moving on to the next question. I reported international travel to my contract company security officer, but then learned from NGA that the security officer had not recorded it. How do we know whether the security officer is doing their job? You don't. You will never know, and you're not the only person that this has happened to. It's happened to quite a few people, which is why I have said probably 20 times now how important it is to get the self-report in writing and create a record of that self-report. So this just proves my point, why it is so important, because you've got a lot of human error out there, and especially if you're dealing with the military, a lot of these security officers have no idea what they're doing. There are times where we'll request an extension to file a statement of reasons. The local security officer is able to award another 30 days, and half of them don't even know that they can do that. So you'd be surprised how little some security officers know, because there's a lot of turnover in some of these positions. So you want to create a good record of a written self-report, save proof that you submitted it, because it is entirely possible that your security officer isn't doing their job. It's possible that they're great and they've been doing it for a really long time, but don't take the chance. All right, and then finally, last question. I'd like to inquire about the best agencies to join if a person's clearance was rejected over a year ago. All right, so we have what we call bleed over, and bleed over is where you have a problem at one agency, and that agency might adjudicate their own clearances, or they might do the typical, what people refer to as a DoD clearance, but then you go to another agency like DOE they don't really communicate with the other organization or the other agency. They do their own adjudications. And then, like I said earlier, FBI, CIA, DIA, there's a bunch of different organizations that do their own security, DHS. You might be able to be denied at one agency and then go to another agency and get a clearance. And it depends on what agency is adjudicating those clearances. So if all of them fall under the typical DoD clearance and that clearance is denied, you have to wait for a year to reapply. But if you go to a different organization, a different agency, you might be able to get them to sponsor you, and you might be able to get them to process you and adjudicate a clearance separate and apart from the typical DoD clearance. You will have to answer the question whether you've ever been denied a security clearance, and you'll have to try to mitigate that and overcome that negative information. But the standard is 1 year. So if you were rejected, it says in the question here, over a year ago, you can reapply, and we include what we call a reapplication brief. So that is similar to a response to a statement of reasons. It's a legal brief that outlines all of the concerns, the facts of the case, and then builds in all the mitigation that we talked about. And these are usually, really thorough packets. Could be anywhere from, say, 50 to 150 page packet. We submit that on behalf of the applicant or the individual who was previously denied, and we do that in an attempt to help them get their clearance. So that's something that we do quite often, and that's something that you would probably want to do if you're trying to get your clearance and you were rejected over a year ago. You can apply anywhere. You can apply at the agency that rejected you over a year ago because the year has passed. All right, I hope that answers all the questions. Pat, you get any other questions in the chat group or anything?
No, Tony, just the ones that we have on screen. No others were submitted.
Great. All right, well, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it. I hope you got some valuable information here tonight. And if there's ever anything we can do to help, don't hesitate to reach out. We'd be happy to assist.